blood pressure and disorders. To begin, we're going to look at blood pressure. We're going to first talk about systolic pressure. We've already learned that systole means contraction. Therefore, systolic pressure is the pressure of contraction. This is going to be the highest pressure that we measure in our blood pressure. When you get your blood pressure taken and they say, for example, it's 120/80, the 120 or the top number is going to be your systolic pressure. Diastolic pressure then, on the other hand, is the pressure of relaxation. This is going to be the lowest pressure, and of course it would be the bottom number in my example of 120/80. 80 would have been the diastolic pressure. The device used to measure blood pressure is called a sphygmomanometer, or you could just call it a blood pressure cuff if you'd prefer. So this is the instrument used to measure your blood pressure. It's normal to have a blood pressure of 120/80 or below that. So taking a look here, we've already mentioned in the lecture on blood vessels that the closer a blood vessel is to the heart, the higher the pressure. So we know that arteries are leaving the heart. They're under the highest pressure. You can see that in arterioles, it starts to, dip down as far as pressure goes. Once we get into capillaries, it's significantly lower, and virtually there's no pressure in veins, which is why we have the three mechanisms in place in order to get the blood back to the heart. This is showing you the device, the sphygmomanometer, and how somebody would go about taking a blood pressure. Basically what they're doing is, you can see the artery in the arm there, the brachial artery. They're going to compress that, and by doing so they inhibit any blood flow through that blood vessel, and when the pressure is released, the blood starts coursing back through that blood vessel, and the high pressure that you get, again, is going to be the systolic pressure, and the low end of the reading is going to be the diastolic pressure. You may have heard of somebody having hypertension. Hyper is going to be elevated or more. Tension in this case is going to be a pressure. Hypertension is known as a silent killer. It is when you have a sustained elevation in blood pressure. The sustained part here is important because, of course, if you went out jogging, you would have an elevation in blood pressure as well. However, if under normal resting circumstances your blood pressure is high, you would have hypertension. A reading somewhere around 140/90 would be considered to be hypertensive. You could also have a situation called isolated systolic hypertension, which simply means that the systolic pressure is significantly high, where the diastolic pressure would be 90 or below. Hypotension, on the other hand, is when you have a low blood pressure. So this is a drop in blood pressure. It can happen by standing up too quickly. You may have had that situation where you've been laying on the couch or something like that, and you stand up real quickly and you get real lightheaded and dizzy. Part of the reasoning behind that is because you stood up so quickly and the blood was working against gravity, and so momentarily you had lack of oxygen to the brain. It can also happen in situations where you have blood loss. So if you've ever given blood and you have passed out as a result, it might have been because of hypotension. Of course, severe blood loss as well. If you were bleeding out, for example, you would pass out as well. Now, the regulation of blood pressure can be a little bit trickier. Blood pressure is something that's maintained via homeostasis. You have what we call baroreceptors in the aorta and the carotid arteries. They detect a change. So we know the aorta is the major blood vessel off the heart, and the carotid arteries are the major blood supply to the head and brain. A baroreceptor is a pressure receptor. This works via a negative feedback loop. For example, if the stimulus is that the blood pressure drops, the result is going to be that the blood pressure rises, and vice versa. So, in our case, our stimulus is that our blood pressure is going to rise. It's going to go up. These baroreceptors inside of the aorta and the carotid arteries are going to send the information to the cardiac centers of the brain. The signal then is sent to the heart and to the blood vessels. So the cardiac center makes a decision on what needs to happen and sends that information both to the heart and to the blood vessels. The heart rate and the cardiac output is lowered. So what that means is that the heart is going to start beating slower, and the amount of blood that's pumped every time it beats is going to be lower. The blood vessels out in the body will also dilate. As the blood vessels dilate, the blood pressure drops. And if this doesn't make sense to you, think about a garden hose. If you have the garden hose turned on, the water's just rushing out a little bit at the end. That would indicate vasodilation. If you indicated vasoconstriction with that, put your thumb over the end of the garden hose. Do you see how that decreases the size of the lumen as vasoconstriction would do? And then you can squirt the water because you've increased the pressure. So again, in this situation, our blood vessels will vasodilate, dropping the blood pressure, and then the blood pressure returns to a normal situation. Again, since this works on a negative feedback loop, the stimulus could have been that the blood pressure dropped, in which case baroreceptors would recognize that information, send it to the cardiac centers. The signal would be sent to the heart and to the blood vessels. However, the result would be opposite. The heart rate and the cardiac output would rise, and then the blood vessels would vasoconstrict to increase blood pressure, again, effectively working on a negative feedback loop. Let's go ahead and talk for a minute about cardiac output. This is the amount of blood pumped into the aorta in 1 minute, or how much blood is your heart putting out. To calculate this, we would take the heart rate, so how many beats per minute, times something we call the stroke volume. The stroke volume is the amount of blood that's going to be pumped out of the heart into the aorta every time the heart beats. So let's say on average you have a heart rate of 75 beats per minute, and you have 70 milliliters per beat. That's going to give you about 5.25 liters every minute. And just to put this into perspective, the average adult male has right around 5 liters of blood in their body. Therefore, every minute your entire volume of blood is being pumped throughout your body. This is regulated by the medulla oblongata, or the part of the brain that regulates cardiovascular activities. A sympathetic response due to epinephrine and norepinephrine being released is going to increase your cardiac output. So as you have that sympathetic response to fight or flight, the cardiac output will be significantly increased. On the flip side, if you have a parasympathetic response, this is going to decrease your cardiac output. As far as cardiovascular disorders go, please review the cardiovascular disorders in your textbook. You will be responsible for these on an exam or quiz. They can be found on pages 180 to 183 in the text.